right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, my next guest has been writing professionally for quite some time, and writing professionally is something we're going to get into. Because I don't know, it just feels like no one embodies that term better than this man.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Between all these works at Dynamite, working on Bat Wheels, doing different things for Warner Brothers, like just a writer's writer. So here to talk with me about his amazing career as a writer, as well as the upcoming Giant Size Savage Tales, is Mr. David Avallone. How are you, sir?
I'm good, thank you. Calling me a writer's writer, that's about as good a compliment as I will ever receive. So I'm quite fond of it. And thank you for that.
Oh, no problem at all. It's funny, like just kind of going through your credits. The idea of a freelance writer, like it sounds scary to me, right? Because
It is scary. You should be scared.
right, like when I hear freelance, as someone who's done freelance marketing and photography, I hear freelance and my brain just says unemployed.
Yeah.
And
No,
then
the risks are enormous. And I've been freelance. I've been in literally Hollywood. I live in Hollywood. I walk out my front door and look to my left, and there's the sign.
wow,
Uh, I mean, it's a mile away, but it's there. Um, in the 40 years I've been out in LA, 39 years, I've had like what you would call a job, maybe 4 years.
wow,
Uh, like something that I went to every day. And these were jobs in post-production or in production. These were not, I still, even when I was in a cubicle, I was in a cubicle making movies. So, it had that going for it. But yeah, you got to get used to. I'm very lucky. I'm going to shout out to my landlord, Vahan Darakian, for being patient and kind and putting up with me when I say, "Hey, man, I'm waiting for a check for New York. It's going to be another week."
mm,
Like, uh, that's my number one advice to new writers. Have a good relationship with your landlord
yeah.
because that's the dude you're going to owe the most money to over the years. So, but yeah, in all seriousness, it's the advantage I have, or maybe it's a disadvantage, is I was raised by a freelance writer. My father was a novelist. He wrote roughly 200 published novels. I would describe him as the most blue collar writer I've ever known. He got up in the morning, he'd go out to coffee at the local diner, he'd drink coffee with the truck drivers and construction workers on their way to work, and then he would come home, hands on the machine, and 8 hours, minimum at the machine, take a break for lunch, play catch with me in the yard, and then back to the pages. And when people ask, how do you write 200 novels? I go, you put in a 40 to 60 hour week, man. That's, most writers do not. I certainly do not. I will say some of that is because that in the 21st century, writers have to do a lot of stuff they didn't have to do in the past, which is have a public persona and post on social media and, writing that stuff for the Patreon and all that. But that's the key is that I love it, and that it's easy to be dedicated to it. And, you mentioned some of the variety in my career, and that's what it's never gets boring. I've always got some, even when I'm writing the sixth Elvira series, still exciting, still found a new thing to talk about, a new thing to make a satire of, whatever. So you never, you never get tired of that.
I'm curious how much of that is like what the balance is between inspiration and just say dedication, right, or discipline.
I
I
think,
mean, go ahead.
yeah, there's a cliche, the cliche artist, right? Is the guy I'm waiting for the muse to visit, and when you're a professional, that is not the gig. The gig is not waiting for the muse to visit. The muse doesn't, we do not have time for the muse to visit. So the inspiration is, I don't want to be too ridiculous and say the inspiration is like I pay the rent, but there is an endless joy in constructing story, in putting words together, in finding the joke. Like that's all the inspiration I need. You know what I mean? The inspiration is what's the next word? What's the next thing I need to do? And that's enough, honestly. Like if you really love it, Um, there are artists, there are writers out there who like agonize over the next word, novelists who write a novel every 10 years. I just can't imagine that. I like doing the thing a lot. I like making the pages. You know what I mean? Like, I don't want to, there's no sentence that I need to think about for a week. There are jokes that I will like come back to. There are story problems that I will pick apart forever, and then I'll move on and write something else and say I'll come back to this. But mostly it's the journey. It's the putting of one foot in front of another. It's putting one word after another. Uh Man, that had better be fun for you, or this is a miserable job. Like
Yeah.
there's a way of looking at being a writer that others have said of like, man, if you didn't like school, this is like you're doing homework for the rest of your life, man. You're writing papers for the rest of your life. But they're papers you want to write. They're, the myth of Sisyphus, right? The guy in hell who's rolling the rock up the hill every day, and at the end of the day, it rolls back under over him, and he gets up and he has to roll it up again, and that's eternity for him. The thing about being any kind of freelance artist, is that you roll the rock up the hill and the rock stays on top of the hill. Now, immediately there's another hill and another rock,
Mm,
and you look to the horizon and it's just rocks and hills stretching out to infinity. But you look back, I've written about 110 comic books now. Those rocks are staying on those hills. That
mm,
rock, that particular rock, doesn't roll back down and crush me. It stays there, and other people get to enjoy it and interact with it, and it means something to them if I did a good job. So that to me is the difference between freelance, for all of its pitfalls, for all of its risks, for all of the fear of I can't pay my health insurance this month. I can't afford groceries. For all of that, it's never the repetition. It's never that thing of like, my gig is I got to sit in this cubicle until 6 p.m., even if I got nothing to do,
mm.
even if I have no meaningful interaction with another human being. I just got to fill in these hours. Um, I will say that one thing that kind of helped me was when I married my wife, she mostly works in production. Before I got married, I was the absolute bachelor freelancer, and I would write at 2 in the morning. I'd write at 3 in the morning. I'd write at midnight. I'd write whenever I felt like it. And at a certain point, I went, my wife deserves to see me when she gets home from work. If she gets home from work and I have just decided, you know what, I'm going to start writing at 7 o'clock tonight. Sorry, you can look at the back of my head.
Mm,
I went, I should try dad's blue collar thing and be wrapped up at dinner time every day, like a man with a job.
right.
You know, too many people look at it, as they said, as that like I'm going to go sit in the park and chase butterflies and wait for Calliope to visit me and tell me what my next mission is. That's not it. It's to me, it's more of a, you know, it's and this is a wild, over, what's the word? Self-aggrandizing way to look at it. To me, a writer is James Bond. You go in the office, they hand you the dossier, and they go, make this right, make this work this shit out. We got to have this done in 6 months. We got to have this done in a week. We got to have this done in 3 hours, whatever it is. There's an excitement to that, and
Mm.
an excitement to the fact that it's always different. It's never the same thing.
It's interesting because I think when I conceptualize the idea of a creative writer, I to me it's the same as like an artist putting paint to canvas. You start
Hmm.
with something blank, and
Hmm.
maybe there's something abstract, and you refine it, and now you have a painting, right?
Hmm.
But listening to you talk about being a writer almost sounds like someone solving like a Sudoku or like a Rubik's cube.
I think that's very much it. It is. Story is story is a set of problems and challenges, and there's a basic contradiction at the heart of how narrative art works. And it's this: in order to be successful, truly successful to the audience, it has to do two things that are absolutely in tension with one another. On the one hand, it has to be surprising. They have to get to the movie and go, "Oh my God, at the end of the book and say, I didn't know that was going to happen. It also has to feel inevitable. The audience has to say, I had no idea it was going to turn out like this, but of course it turned out like this. This was the only satisfying way this story could end. That is pulling that rabbit out of the hat every single time is a challenge. Making that, and I would never claim that I've done it every time. I would never claim that I've always surprised and always had that feeling of inevitability. But that feeling, it's so, and you know this as a reader, as a viewer, that feeling when the chips, when it all falls into place and you go, oh, of course. Or even when you're a minute ahead of the movie or the book and you go, I think I know where this is going to go. And I'm so excited because I think I'm guessing right. I
Right.
think I've figured out how the hero is going to get out of this. I think I've figured out how the two lovers are going to come together. I think I've figured out how they can kill this monster that's been unkillable for 90 minutes. But the audience, letting the audience have that feeling of, oh, I think I know, is so powerful. And it's so, we all want that feeling. So to be able to provide that for someone, uh, on top of all the other things you provide in satisfying art, you know,
Yeah.
is that's the challenge. And I approach it always. I'm a fan. I'm a reader. I love books. I love movies. I love comic books. I love TV shows. So, I always what would satisfy me? What would excite me? What works for me? I don't come up with some imaginary, you know, mid-range human being who isn't me. What would they think? It's like that'll that undermines your ability to do what you do. The one piece of writing advice, I think the most central one is the question you always have to ask yourself is, what do I have to bring to this? What do I have to say about this? What is my perspective on this that is unique? What is the joke only I will tell? What is the story only I will tell? And as long as you keep asking yourself that question, and as long as you can keep satisfactorily answering it, you don't have to worry about what anyone else is doing. I've always said it's the mark of an amateur that they're really super guarded about their ideas. But ideas are nothing. Anyone can have an idea. It's all how you do it can be so different from how someone else would do it. You know
Right.
what I mean? And that's bringing to every project, what's the thing that only I would do? That's really the key to it, I think.
So you spoken like someone with like a true like vision, or at the very least like confident in their abilities, right? And I don't know. Typically, the first time I talk to someone on the show, it's kind of like the big epic origin story, uh,
Sure.
and we spend a lot of time on like, well, how did you break in, and so on, right? And I don't know. You being a second generation writer, I imagine there's not like, well, I could be, maybe I'm presumptuous, but I would assume there's like, because you have a sort of blueprint, that you're not necessarily agonizing on how you're going to get in or do the thing.
Well,
Or are you?
I mean, I'll tell you, I've actually only been writing comic books, which is the key to my late in life success for 12 years. I was in indie film I mean, I still am, honestly. But I moved to California in 87 when I got out of college. I'm 60 years old. And I don't, my first revelation when I moved to LA as a filmmaker, I remember one Friday night, I picked up a newspaper going, let's go to the movies. And I'm looking at the movies that are playing in movie theaters. And at that particular weekend, there was nothing I wanted to see. And a light bulb went off over my head, maybe a few years too late since I was already in Los Angeles. I was like, I'm not sure that the things that I want to do will ever be acceptable to studio executives at major motion picture studios. maybe I should have thought about that before I moved to Los Angeles and threw all my eggs in the, when I was making indie films for 30, 40 years, people would say, so, I'd meet someone new and they'd say, are you in the film industry? And I'd always say, imagine a guy lives in Detroit. In his backyard, he builds concept cars with his bare hands. He sells them to a couple of hundred people. Is he in the automobile industry? Or is he a guy making cars in his backyard who just happens to live in Detroit? That's who I am. I'm the guy making cars in his backyard. So it really wasn't until uh, I sort of stumbled into the comic book industry and had some success in that. That created opportunities for me as a prose writer, writing short stories. That created an opportunity for me working like I got the best jobs I ever had in film because I was a comic book writer, which I found ironic. But there's a way in which the greatest fear any executive has or any producer has is to take a risk on someone no one else has ever taken a risk on.
Mm,
And when you've been published by a publisher, when you've worked on IP, even in comic books, that means that somewhere a big corporation said, it's okay if this guy writes Vampirella. It's okay if this guy writes Red Sonja. Therefore, when we hire him and our boss says, why'd you hire that guy? I've never heard of him. He's, oh, well, he writes the Elvira Mistress of the Dark comics. He has some credibility. I did not get that credibility when I had made a dozen independent films.
mm,
That did not convey any credibility onto me. But I could write for a Batman TV show for Warner Brothers Animation because I was a comic book guy. I had the comic book pedigree. I could work on the development of the Red Sonja movie because I had written Red Sonja for Dynamite. So I had credibility in that arena. So it's not, and the thing is, like I said, I had cynicism about whether or not I could get in terms of the film industry. And like in the 90s, I had a really bad run where some studio executive or producer, people with legitimate credits, would suggest I write something. Oh, we don't have any money, but do a draft and then we'll sell it and we'll all be millionaires. And just a lot of writing for to no avail and projects that didn't go anywhere and producers who evaporated like smoke when I pushed them and said, hey, I thought you were going to try and sell this thing. Like I did my part writing the script. They couldn't do their part of putting together the deal. So look, and I have no bitterness or resentment that it took so long for me to get into the position I am now, where I get to write things that I like,
mm,
that have meaning for me, that I can stand behind and say, this is my work. This reflects me. The work I did in independent films very rarely reflected me, honestly, because rarely was I the writer or director on it. I was the editor. I was the producer. I acted a bit. I still act a bit. But comics really came along when independent film had burned me to a crisp and saved my creative soul. And I'm lucky, Dynamite, who publishes, has published maybe 80% of my output. They're a small company. They're probably the fifth or sixth largest comic book company domestically. But because of that, they don't really ride me hard creatively. I get virtually no notes on what I write. Someone once asked me what my page rate was at Dynamite, and I told them, and they were like, wow, Marvel would pay you 3 times that. I was like, yeah, and they'd make me write it 5 times. And guys in studio suites in Hollywood who don't know anything about comic books would say, "Oh no, no, we can't do that with Spider-Man. We can't. That can't happen to Tony Stark in a comic book. That's where we can't do that." So I don't get any of that.
mm,
I work with on the Elvira comics, for example. The only person who gives me notes is Cassandra Peterson, Elvira herself,
mm,
and bless her, she loves my writing, and I get very few notes. I get a couple of joke punch ups in issue, and she always says, "Now this is just a suggestion. You don't have to take like it's an Elvira joke written by Elvira. I believe I will use it. Thank you very much." But all that to say, it's like, yeah, it actually was a long and winding road to get to where I am now, and I'm very happy to be where I am now, and I want to. make as much stuff as I possibly can in the time I have left on this earth.
Mm.
And my dad had a very roller coastery career himself. He got blacklisted in the mid 70s because at the height of his career, because it was pretty common at the time, it still is pretty common, to underreport royalties to authors. And he had like a dozen books in bookstores, and he was being lied to, and he made a stink. And on the good news was he got his money. The bad news was every publisher said, that guy's a troublemaker. Let's never work with him again. And he eventually, editors that liked working with him paid him under the table. He wrote under dozens of pen names and all that, but he never got back to where he was. So, like, I'm the opposite of a Nepo baby. There was a time where people were like, oh, we don't want to deal with anyone related to Michael Avallone. But my dad was a master at what he did. Um, and the thing that it is an advantage. There are a lot of advantages. One is that he taught me a lot about storytelling, obviously, but another one is that I had an example that this is a perfectly reasonable thing for an adult man to do for a living, to be a storyteller. And I think that's partially cultural. My father was Italian American. His father was a marble stone cutter.
Mm.
If you go to the Bronx and Manhattan, you can walk into any cemetery, Catholic cemetery, you will see the mini Jesuses and Marys of Michelangelo Avallone, my grandfather.
Mm.
So there's an Italian thing where it's not weird, it's not fruity, it's not unmanly to be an artist. It's very manly to be an artist.
Mm.
And that's not really true in like WASP Protestant world where, why don't you get a job down at the bank? Like I never had that pressure from my parents. And my mother was a political activist. Like I always say one of the advantages I had is if my parents had ever said to me, why don't you get a real job? I could have said, you first, guys. Like neither of you have had a real job my whole life. Uh, but it's an advantage to have parents that are heroes and that you can look up to and that provide an inspiring example.
For sure. And so you've said that comics sort of came along when you were at a point where you were like burnt out
Yeah.
with indie filmmaking. You've also said that you stumbled into comics. How did this
Well,
chance
the
meeting
what
happen?
happened was I was making behind the scenes because I do whatever I could in filmmaking to make a buck. I stumbled into a pretty good job uh, shooting and editing behind the scenes footage for a television show called Winona Earp from the Sci-Fi Channel. Fun show, lovely people working on it. And the person I was working for knew I was a writer and asked just kind of out of left field one day, I'd like to read something of yours. Can I see an old script of yours? Took her 6 months to read it. But she was married to a comic book writer. And she said, look, I can't help you get this movie made or anything, but I can recommend you to some comic book editors. And at San Diego Comic Con that year, she introduced me to Dynamite's editor in chief, Joe Ryban, and we had drinks. One of the things I do at conventions is I teach networking. And, the prime example of it, we did not talk about comic books, me and Joe. We talked about books we liked. We talked about movies we liked. We had a great time, got along, hit it off. And he said, I'll go back to New York and see if I can find a book for you. Just test you out. And he tested me out on a book called Legendary Vampirella, which was a steampunk Vampirella story. Very niche artifact, but and I did the thing, and this is another thing that I always recommend to people. I think a lot of people have this idea that they can come into comics from a background in film and I'll change my screenplay to panel descriptions, and that's a comic book script.
Mm.
I took it seriously. I reread Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, which is the, the Bible of how to make comics. I I grew up wanting to be a filmmaker. I watched films as I was a little kid with an eye towards, even as a child, acting and directing and cinematography and music and editing and all that. I read comics completely uncritically. like with no eye towards how does this work? What engine drives this? What propels you through the book? Why does is this structured like this? So I went over to my shelf. I pulled down Darwin Cook's New Frontier. Every page is three CinemaScope panels. Darwin's making a movie. Darwin's laying out storyboards for the movie in your mind. And when there's a big moment, you turn the page, it's the whole page. Fantastic. Watchmen, nine panel grid. Completely the opposite of what Darwin is doing, not cinematic at all, but atomized time. Time broken into nine parts every page. And again, when something big happens, he breaks the pattern. Like I had never noticed that. You know, Frank Miller, Dark Knight Returns, he can have a page with 300 panels on it because they're little TV screens when people are talking. Crazy. Chaikin's brilliant American Flag. That thing is designed like the genius of the page design in that book alone. There's a book in that. There's an essay in it. But I learned from those great masters what the variation of panel size and what the variation of panels and I had a great conversation with Chaikin once years later where he was talking about how the page, in movies, time is what it is. The director can slow it down or speed it up. The viewer can do nothing about that unless he's got a remote control, which is not how I grew up watching movies. There was no remote control until I was well over 20. But in a comic book, the size of the panel, the amount of detail in the art, and the amount of words in the panel determine how long the viewer will probably look at it. Now, you can't control that. You can't make them read every word. You can't make them look at all the details you drew. But if you draw a very detailed panel and put a lot of words in it, the odds are pretty good they're going to spend more than 2 seconds looking at it. So in comics, and this was the thing that blew my mind, space equals time. How you manage space is how you manage the amount of time the viewer spends with it. That's fascinating to me. All that to say, and like the page turn, I am obsessed with the page turn. At the premise that the lower right hand panel always should lead you to be interested in the upper left hand panel when you turn the page. No surprises on an odd numbered page
Mm.
because you can see it out of the corner of your eye. When you're looking at page two, you can see page three. If Godzilla suddenly appears on page three, you're going to stop reading page two, and then you're doing this, and you've lost the flow
Right.
of the comic. Eye trace, huge thing in comics. Nothing like eye trace or the page turn exists in any other art form. It's a really specific thing to comics. Learning all that, and I say this a lot, it was so invigorating. I was 49 years old and it was like being back in sixth grade and like, here are the finger paints, man. Like, play with this. Here's a brush for the first time. Here's a pen for the first time. It was learning a new language of art, learning a new art form and how to do it. And by taking it seriously, it made it so much fun for me. And boy, I recommend that. Like mostly people like, oh, that's for when you're a kid, you figure out what your discipline is going to be. You start learning the piano, you start writing, you start your ballet classes. But I got to tell you, picking up a new brush at 49 is literally makes you young again. It literally makes you 10 years old again. And the joy that I have found in this new thing, and again, that has led to, I had written prose in the past, but now I'm doing it a lot.
Mm.
Um, and I've written scripts in the past. I'd never written animation for children's television. It's a new thing. So all these new things, uh, it keeps it from ever getting stale. And all that to say that was, my origin story was I did all that. I absorbed as much as I could in the time that I had on my deadline. I sat down, I wrote my first script, I put it in. I told you Dynamite has little editorial finagling with you. I called up a colleague and I said, "Oh, Joe hates the script. I haven't heard a word from him." And the colleague was like, "Someone's drawing it right now, man." Like, if you didn't hear anything from him, it's because it's good and he has no notes. And I went, "Oh, really? We're doing it?" Because I'm used to Hollywood where it's just notes, 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 notes. So that was my origin story. And Joe and I have a great working relationship. And He keeps giving me stuff to write, and this year, we talked about I have the Savage Tales, the giant size Savage Tales coming out. I have a creator-owned book coming out from them this year. I'm working on the first issue of the next Elvira series. I'm working on the second issue of another secret project that they haven't announced yet. It's like a lot on my plate. And I mean, this is the other thing though. When I got my first paycheck, I was like, oh, so I have to write 3 of these a month, bare minimum, to even remotely be able to survive. And that's with my wife earning a living. You know what I mean? Like, in order to support us both, this can't be a thing where if I do one a month, that's not a career.
Mm,
That's not. I used to go into a comic book store and go like, "Wow, Mark Waid's writing a lot of books," or Palmiotti's got his name on a lot of books. Now I know why.
right.
Because and those guys command a much higher pay rate than me. But I have a good friend Rodney Barnes, and there was a period when, Rodney's got so much work and does so much stuff. And I asked him once, I said, Rodney, man, you just pounding it out and you got so much stuff going on. And he said, David, I was homeless once living in my car. And I said, you know, take advantage while, do it while they're still asking you to do it. And he said, Amen, brother. Like that's someone asks you to write a thing. Don't say no.
Yeah.
You're a professional. You got a lot of stuff on your plate. Make the time. Pound out the words. You can do it.
Now, with that, because you talked about sort of falling in love with the format of comic
Uh-huh.
writing and the page turn and panel designs and all of that. But, you've also been opened up to a lot of other opportunities. So now you're doing writing for screen and animation and all these other things. Is it difficult to switch mediums for the jobs?
Not really. No, I have to say, like I have enough of there's such different muscles in a way. Um, that I can go back and forth between them because it doesn't create any I don't have any confusion between them. I mean, when I haven't animation in particular is the thing, like if I haven't written it for a while, I go back and look at some old scripts and I'm like, right, right, right. This is like that's what and that's really more about what's the presentation the client is used to.
Right.
Like I don't want to lay this thing out in a way that they're not used to that they don't like. Um, but I don't like now I've been doing this long enough. It's not like I go from writing a screenplay where you can put multiple, you write a scene slug and you can say, this is always the example I come up with for some reason. In a screenplay, you can say interior Matt Murdock's apartment. Matt Murdock walks in the room, throws down his keys on the table, picks up a remote control, turns on the TV. TV, Balloon One TV. In other news, Daredevil was seen injured on the West Side today. In a comic book, that's 5 panels.
Mm,
You know, that's that's 5 different slugs to get you there. Or it's one panel where you go, and bad people who come to comic books from screenplays always make that mistake. They put more than one physical action in a panel, and it's like, no, I can only see the one thing,
right.
or the aftermath of it, or but uh, but yeah, so I don't struggle with that a lot. And again, prose is such a different gear. And ironically, like it's the most work and the least amount of pay, but it's also really satisfying when it works. So, you know, I'm still doing it.
And so you said that, in comics, you've sort of finally gotten a chance to do the types of stories that you enjoy doing. How would you describe your, I guess, style or taste as a writer?
It's a funny thing. Like people ask you a lot, like, what's your favorite genre? I get asked that a lot. I don't really have a favorite genre. I mean, I'll tell you what I know what the hallmarks of my work are.
Okay.
Like what maybe makes me different from anyone else doing what I do. I'm a nut for pacing. I really I don't slow things down very much, particularly in the Elvira books, which are comedies. It's like joke, 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 joke. I can't go 2 panels without something funny happening. That's a
Mm.
mistake. That's bad writing in a comedy. Um, but in general, I love to keep things moving swiftly. And I like transitions that are thoughtful and artistic. I don't just cut from one scene to another. I find a thing in the previous scene that interacts in an interesting way with the next scene. You do the thing where someone says something in the previous scene, for example, and someone in the next scene says something that seems to answer it, even though it's two different conversations happening. You know what I mean? That kind of like physical, you know, uh, the montage
Hmm.
and intercutting in a way that like makes everything kind of like seamless and I like things to have a flow to them.
Hmm.
I like to write about smart people. I believe that there's something I got from 1930s film directors and film writers is that everyone is a character in one of my books. If you got a doctor that walks into a room and has one line of dialogue, even if it's just we got the results from your heart test and they're good, like there's got to be something interesting about him. There's got to be like he's got to say something funny or something weird or something that makes him more of a character than just like in a 1930s comedy, the characters will get in the cab and there's a cab driver. The cab driver will always have at least one killer line,
Hmm.
whether it's funny or smart or whatever. You know what I mean? Like no one is just here's that report you asked for, sir. Like that stuff's boring.
Right.
And you try everything in your power to go, what's the twist I can put on the guy who's showing Captain Kirk the report on the pad? You know what I mean? What can I do to make that guy more interesting than just Lieutenant Nobody? So if you think of like everyone is starring in their own movie, even the guy who just like that guy's got a whole life. And I'm not one of those, I'm not writing a bio for that guy. Like I'm not overdoing it. But you just ask yourself in every situation, what's the way to do this no one's ever done before? What's the way to do this that's a one of my favorite examples of how you deal with cliches. David Mamet, who's turned into a right wing maniac, and we don't have to listen to him anymore. But once upon a time, he's a pretty good writer. And how you deal with a cliche situation. There's a movie called Heist, and at the end of the movie, Danny DeVito pulls out a gun on Gene Hackman, and he says, "I hate to say something so cliche as I'm going to count to three, but one, you know, like, and that's funnier than the guy just pulling out the gun and saying, I'm going to count to three. Like, you got to acknowledge that this is a dumb cliche, and we've seen it in every gangster movie ever made. And the characters are self aware enough to know, like, we're doing this now. Okay. you know, I wrote a thing once, and I can't even remember which comic it was, where the sentiment that the villain was going to say was, "It's not business. It's always it's personal. It's not personal. It's business." And I prefaced it with him saying, "Are you going to make me quote The Godfather to you?"
Hmm.
You know.
Yeah.
And the other guy goes, "I get it. It's not personal. It's business." And the other guy goes, "Right."
Mm.
That's the way I got around having a guy actually say it's not business, it's not personal, it's business.
Right.
Because that was the correct note in the scene, but oh, it's so dull, and you don't want to be taking dialogue from The Godfather. So I feel like you have to approach every sequence in what's the we've seen this a million times. There's a I'm a big fan of director commentaries on movies. I love and writer commentaries. Love listening to them. And one of my favorite not great movies is the Bond movie Diamonds Are Forever. There's a scene in that where Sean Connery goes to rescue a guy and he's being guarded by two tiny little lady gymnasts and they beat the shit out of him. And it's funny and it's unusual and whatever. And on the commentary, the director is this old English guy named Guy Hamilton is like, so in the screenplay, Sean comes to rescue Willard White, and there's some big fellow, and they get into a fight. And oh my God, we've just seen it and seen it and seen it. And I was watching the Summer Olympics with my wife, and we were watching the gymnasts, and I went, my God, these women are terrifying. Wouldn't it be hilarious to see two little 90-pound girls just beat the ever-loving crap out of Big Sean Connery? How great would that be? And it's again, it's a unique scene in that movie, and it makes it not a cliche. It makes it wonderful and unusual, and you've never seen a scene like that before or since. And so I think as a writer, I try to do that.
Mm,
I try to like, what's the I try to be the enemy of cliches and tropes, even when you have to use them. There are things you cannot get around. The guy will pull the gun out and count to three. What will you? What can you do to make that interesting? What can you do to make that different? So, and the dialogue, I, I can never be 100% serious because honestly, I don't think life is 100% serious. I think the worst times in your life, there's still shit that happens that's funny. I love telling the story. The day my dad died, which is one of the worst days of my life, he died on the second floor of a like duplex with a very small crooked staircase. And the two guys came to get his body and put it in the hearse. And they went up the stairs and they're coming down the stairs with the body and they couldn't get it around the turn in the staircase. And they were trying to be respectful and they didn't want to bend him. And I was sitting there on the couch watching them and I was like, I'm weeping, and this is the funniest thing I have ever seen in my life. These two poor guys trying not to upset me as they try to manhandle my dad's body down a staircase. It's ghastly. It's the worst. Like I said, I'm having the worst moment of my entire life, and yet I'm like this is funny. Like these two guys struggling with the dead body. I'm gonna put this in a movie someday because it's so sad and funny and beautiful all at the same time. So. I will always, maybe sometimes to my detriment, I'll reach for the joke if it's there. I won't let a moment be so deadly serious that I won't go, well, but here's the ridiculous thing about this.
mm.
So,
So that kind of brings up a point, right? Like just being observant, right? Like I can tell that you kind of spend a lot of time just looking at the world around you, right? To be able to find humor in things, is one, but even just kind of like, all right, everybody in this story is a character, right?
yeah.
Like I used to go out like back in the day when I used to write music, I wrote rap songs and I would do like these
Hmm.
my favorite things would be like these storytelling rap songs. And like to get inspiration, I would often just kind of sit outside and just watch people. Just like,
Right.
okay, like and just make up a story about this person. Like, oh, they're walking fast because they got a math class or whatever, right? But it's just a fun exercise to sort of take
Hmm.
yourself out of your head and what you've got going on and like try to picture somebody else's shoes. Which is probably why most creatives I speak with are like left leaning because it's like you can't look at the world around you and
Well,
like
because it's
see yourself
empathy.
in other shoes. Right. Exactly.
The core of being a liberal, which I will happily identify as, is you give a shit about other people. You give a shit about what they feel and what they think and what hurts them, and you try to avoid hurting them, and you try to stay out of their business, if it is best to stay out of their business. And I am definitely a I am the guy that will have the conversation with the cab driver. I'm the guy that will ask the waiter where he's from and what is that accent? Where are you from originally? I am the guy that will shake hands with the valet parking guy and have a conversation with him. You know what I mean? Because they're people.
Right.
They're all people. They're all in. No one is here to serve me. No one is here to be an extra in the movie in which I'm a star. They're there to be guest stars.
Mm.
And you never know. I was thinking about this the other day. There's a man, when I was moving across country, I had this interaction I've remembered for 40 years. I had a big old 1971 Chevy Impala. And this parked it in Colorado to go into a convenience store to get Coca-Cola or coffee or something. And I come out and there's this big mountain of a man looking at the car. And his Colorado is so intense that he thinks and speaks slowly, not badly, but slowly. He's a deep thinker. And I talk very fast. I'm from New Jersey. And I can see when I speak, I can literally watch him play it back slowed down in his head until he understands it and then he responds. Anyway, he asked me about, he wants to buy the car because the car is beautiful. And I say, no, I need it. I'm driving to California. And he says, why, uh, why are you going to California? and I, say I'm the film industry and I want to work in the film industry and that's in California. And I end on the deathless cliche, you're only young once. And this guy who was 60 something clearly does this, but for a very long time. That is the profoundest shit anyone has ever said to me. And it was a random dude who walked up to me on the street in Colorado in 1987. You're only young once, but for a very long time. That's gold. Like I'm 60, so I still think about you're young for a very long time. And my point is that's the thing to find in your writing is that the random dude who's like, "Hey, beautiful car, can I buy it?" That dude may have some reserve of Yoda-like wisdom buried inside him, and if you say the right thing to him, you're going to trigger it and get a aphorism that's going to stick with you your entire life. And it's, you're talking about observing, but it's about living. It's about actually living and engaging with people and engaging with their lives and doing shit that you're afraid of and having experiences sometimes just to have the experience. And, I try very hard not to speak ill of any colleague, anyone who's making art for a living because it's hard what we do and but I make an exception for some sacred cows. So I will take a second to slam Tarantino. And nothing in his work is resonant of real life. His movies are about movies. It's a guy who watches a lot of movies. Like I watch his movies and I'm like, have you actually kissed a girl? Like I don't really think you have from watching this movie. You've seen movies about girls getting kissed. You've seen movies about people shooting each other. But I don't know that you've lived
Mm,
because there's no life to any of this. The life is the life of movies, and that can be fun and thrilling. I love movies. Movies are great, but I don't want to make movies about other movies. And I say this as someone whose work is full to the brim of references to other art, not just movies. There's references to literature, there's references to plays, there's references to comic books, there's references to everything. And I love that shit. I love a lot of the Elvira books are movie parodies. I think the funniest thing I ever wrote was there's one where she's stuck in the movie The Shining trying to get out. And she interacts with Jack Nicholson and all that stuff. I think that's the funniest thing I ever wrote. But it's not just like an appreciation of The Shining written within the enclosed world of movie fandom. You know what I mean? I like to think everything I write breathes a little more than that and feels like I hate anyone to read what I wrote and think this guy's never talked to a human being with this job or with this life experience or with this from this community or from this group. You know what I mean? And I know what my limitations are.
mm,
Um, I when I got the gig writing Betty Page, I did a lot of research about Betty Page. I am not a 27-year-old fashion model from Nashville, Tennessee. If there's a human being I have the least in common with in the world, it's probably Betty Page. Um, but I know people who were alive in the 50s. I know the culture of the time. I have known people from Tennessee. I have known people from the Deep South and the not so Deep South. And I also ask questions. And I watched a documentary about Betty Page that was narrated by her.
mm,
And I listened to her voice for 90 minutes. And when it was over, I went, I can write that voice. I don't know that I can write any other random 27-year-old girl from Nashville, Tennessee. But now that I've heard Betty Page speak nonstop for 90 minutes, I know what her voice is. I know how she feels about the world. I know how she approaches crisis and difficulty. And I can write that.
mm,
And I needed that. Before I watched that documentary, I was like, this is so far outside of my voice. And that was relatively early in my comics writing career. I was only like 2 or 3 years in. Uh, like you're writing Vampirella. Vampirella is a comic book character
yeah.
who has some very unreal things about her that makes her fairly easy to write. She's a vampire from another planet. Like that's no one can tell you, oh, that's not what vampires from another planet are like. Yeah, whatever, man. But someone who's a 27-year-old from Tennessee can say that ain't her. That ain't us.
Yeah.
So I needed to really like take a deep dive into her voice and find it and hear it and go, okay. And, had I met her, that would have served the same purpose. Had I met, when you've met people or interacted with people who are from certain walks of life, you can better put yourself in your head. You've heard them react to things. You've seen how they move through the world.
I was trying to think of what I know of the 50s, and all I got is Happy Days.
Yeah. Which is really about the 70s. Like
Ah,
it's very strongly about the 1970s. Um, but yeah, my dad, was born in 1924, and a lot of his jargon, and that's the thing a lot of people don't think about when they're working on things that are set in a particular period. You see it sometimes in movies. Movie takes place in 1972, and every car on the street is from 1972. Every car on the street in 1972 was from 1965. You know what I mean? Like was from 58, was from, the people weren't, there were people who talked the way people talk in the 70s, but everyone over the age of 40 is talking the way people talked in the 40s.
mm,
Everyone over the age of 50 is talking the way people talked in the 20s. So you have to, it's a whole world. And the more you know about, and as you said, the more you observe people and talk to people, writers should always have friends of every age. I mean, I think human beings should always have friends of every age.
mm,
I think it's good for you. It's good for your mind. It's good for your spirit. It's good for your understanding of the world you live in. But a writer in particular, I don't know that I would go out and confidently write a 16-year-old girl in 2026. But I know some people who could set up some meetings with 16-year-old girls and I could maybe learn something from them.
mm,
More likely at this part of my point in my life, I would say, would you like to co-write this with me and double check my work? And I've done, I wrote a Betty Page issue that was set in Scotland. And I sent the script to a Scottish woman I know and said, can you just make sure I haven't screwed up the slang and the lingo and the accent and all that? And she wrote back and said, great, you did a good job.
mm,
I actually read a whole article about the difference between Scottish as it is spoken in Glasgow and Scottish as it is spoken in Edinburgh and the different slang that's used
mm.
to mean the same thing so that I would get the Edinburgh character correct. She wouldn't be using Glaswegian slang. I did anyone reading it give a shit? I have no idea. But I have a theory that there's something about authenticity that even if you don't know what the real thing would be, you know what authenticity feels like.
Mhm.
Even if you don't know that car wasn't around in 1955, there's a part of you that goes, I don't know about cars from the 1950s, but that feels wrong. That looks wrong. I don't know why. It just looks wrong. But when it's right, your brain goes, no, that feels right. That works for me.
And there's always, well, maybe not always, I don't know, but I like to imagine there's always someone who does know the real thing
Yeah,
and they appreciate it when they see it.
absolutely. And that's the same thing that's true of, I like I said, I put a ton of Easter eggs in my work because I know that as a fan, I love you feel so like this joke is for me.
Hmm.
This is my joke. Uh, and I put some incredibly deep cuts in shit. And, I always try to use the Bugs Bunny rule, which is it still funny,
Mm,
even if you don't get the thing? The example I always use, there's a Bugs Bunny cartoon from the early 40s with the gremlin. And Bugs at one point says, do you think that was a gremlin? And the gremlin comes right up to his ear and screams, well, it ain't Wendell Wilkie. Wendell Wilkie's a funny name.
mm,
I happened to watch that cartoon with my father, who was alive in the 1940s, and he turned to me and said, Wendell Wilkie was the Republican candidate for president who ran against FDR and lost in a landslide. I was like, okay, that's a little funnier,
mm.
but it's still funny.
Right.
Even if you don't know who Wendell Wilkie is, it's a funny name. The voice of the gremlin going, "Well, it ain't Wendell Wilkie," is funny, but it works whether you get it or not. And
Right.
I try to do that as much as possible. It doesn't always work. I
Mm.
said to the editor when I handed in the script for the Shining issue, I was like, man, if you haven't seen The Shining, this is just the most incomprehensible thing you've ever read. And he's like, dude, we're marketing this to Elvira fans. Do you really imagine anyone reading an Elvira comic book has somehow missed out on seeing The Shining? Like, you're probably pretty safe making really specific jokes about The Shining,
Right.
you know?
So we talk about like sort of catching nuance and
Mm.
in a way sort of keeping stories separate or understand sort of the utility for different writing styles and such. And that kind of brings me to Giant Size Savage Tales,
Sure.
which for you guys listening, final order cutoff on this issue. It's a big old giant size one shot. Final order cutoff is March 30th.
Oh, okay. I actually didn't know that. That's good to know.
Nice.
So tell your local comic book shop you want a copy of Giant Size Savage Tales.
And so this is going to put David with four different artists telling four different stories featuring
It's
four.
actually three artists. One guy did draw two stories,
Oh, he
which
did.
is
Nice.
unusual. But yeah, Mariano drew the Vampirella story and the Gulliver of Mars story. Usually it is a different artist on every story, but we someone had to drop out and we had to put Mariano on two stories, and he did an amazing job.
Got you. So there's a Vampirella story, a Red Sonja story, an Alan Quartermain story, and a Gulliver of Mars story.
Yes.
Um, for one, like, what's your experience with these characters? Like, do you have a favorite?
I have written all of them before,
Okay,
so that's nice. So I'm comfortable with them. Gulliver is a funny one. When they asked me to do the first Gulliver story, I think it was 3 or 4 issues of Savage Tales ago, I said, "Oh, that book is terrible. Gulliver of Mars. It's from 1898. The writer is trying to do both a picaresque adventure story and Swiftian satire, which is not subtle. The character's named Gulliver. If you couldn't get that he's trying to do Jonathan Swift Gulliver's Travels, like name the character Gulliver in case you missed it. And because he's not a very good writer, he ends up writing a thing where the satire is really weak and the character is just an absolute loser. And when they asked me to do it, I said, the book's terrible. Can I do whatever I want? And they were like, yeah, there's not a legion of fans of a 19th century public domain character who are going to come after you for violating the spirit of color. But the thing is, I didn't violate anything in the continuity of the story. I decided to go with the fact that that's basically it's very similar to John Carter Mars. American military man ends up on Mars, ends up getting involved in a war, a conflict between two different racial groups, rescues the princess from the barbarians, brings the princess back to the capital city. The barbarians attack the city. They kill the king. The princess tries to get away. They destroy the city. And the hero, rather than doing anything about that, he gets an opportunity to go back to Earth. And he goes, you know what? I'm outie. I don't need to be a part of this. So I'm a big history guy. And I love doing historical research on things. And I went, well, what So that's 1898. He goes back to Earth at the end of the story. He meets the girl of his dreams decides that she will marry him. They get married. End of story. I was like, what's he doing 20 years later during World War One? What's he how did the outbreak of the Spanish flu affect his life?
hmm,
So in my story, the Spanish flu has killed his wife because, millions of people died worldwide in 1917, even while World War One is going on. It's like the pandemic happening during a major war.
hmm,
And he knows he's been a coward. He knows that he failed on Mars. And in the book, the thing that gets you to Mars, it's crazy, is a flying carpet. He says, I wish I was on Mars because he's very unhappy about what's happening to him in New York City. And a flying carpet wraps him up and takes him to Mars. It's nuts.
hmm,
So I have him in the trenches of France in 1918, and his sergeant asks him, why'd you volunteer for this horrible combat duty? And he said, I've been a coward. I ran away from a fight I should have stuck around from, and it has haunted me for 20 years. And then Woodrow Wilson kindly gave me this opportunity to be brave again. And he starts to say, I wish, and the carpet comes back.
mm,
And he takes the opportunity to return to Mars and set everything right. And when he gets there, there's been a war raging for 20 years. The princess that was in love with him has lost an eye. She's battle scarred, all of this stuff. And so I've written 3 chapters of this, and this is the final fourth chapter. It's 16 pages, and it wraps up the saga in a way that I'm very, very happy with. But it's a great example of like taking something. I believe that when you get IP, you always like open the hood
mm,
and go, what makes this work? Why do people love this? What's important about this? What can I learn from this? And this is one of the rare cases where what's under the hood is this was badly done originally. And I think I can, without changing anything that happened to the guy, without making him a different character, I can say 20 years later he's a different man and he realizes how badly he did and he wants to redeem himself. That's
mm,
a good story. I'm interested in that story. So, and I'll tell you another, in previous Savage Tales, I've written a John Carter Warlord of Mars story. Now, I've loved John Carter, Warlord of Mars, as a character my whole life, but there's one thing about him that always drove me crazy, and that's that he's a former Confederate officer. And you cannot convince me that a former Confederate cavalry officer is a good guy. I don't buy it. So I took an opportunity when I wrote my first John Carter story ever. I said, I have to fix this for myself.
mm,
And it's convoluted how we get there, but at the end of this story, they have rescued the mastermind of Mars, the guy, the great telepath of Mars. And I don't know if you know John Carter's backstory. He's an eternal man. He doesn't know when he was born. He doesn't know his origin story. He just knows he's always been a soldier.
mm,
And Deja says, "Why don't you let him read your mind, and he'll figure out who you really are, maybe." And the mastermind puts his hands on John Carter's head, and he gets this explosion of violent imagery, and he has to break off contact. And John Carter says, "What did you learn about me?" He says, "I'm sorry, my son. I could not go far back enough to find out who you were and what your origins were." He's like, "I'll tell you this. You're just a killer. You don't you didn't believe in anything. You didn't fight for a cause. You just killed because it's who you were. And when you met her, Deja Thoris, with her grace and her wisdom and her mercy and her empathy, she changed you. You did not fight for justice on Earth. You did not fight for what was right on Earth until you fell in love with Deja Thoris, and she made you the man you are today, the Warlord of Mars." So I got to say out loud, being a Confederate officer, like I'm basically saying he joined the Confederate Army because he was in Virginia when the war broke out, and it didn't fucking matter to him what color uniform he wore. And I needed that. I
mm,
could not write that. I could not write about a guy who defended slave owners and pretend he was a good guy. I could not fucking do it. I could not look myself in the mirror and write, because it's one of my least favorite tropes, the
mm,
noble Confederate. Fuck that noise. So I got to change John Carter's origin story, and I think it's actually more beautiful
mm,
that he's a good man only because he fell in love for the first time in 1,000 years. And she really meant something for him. And she is such a good person that he had to become a good person to be worthy of her. And that's anyway, that's a little long story short about writing IP
yeah.
and how you try to engage in it in a way that's Vampirella. I don't need to change anything about her. She is wonderful the way she is. I always say it's like writing Superman with no moral compass.
Mm,
Like she has, well, not no moral compass, but her own very specific. I walk through a world where I can rip people's heads off with my bare hands. I'm an apex predator on a planet full of sheep, but it's bad to take advantage of the fact that they're sheep. And I don't like vampires that feed on the innocent. So I am at war with vampires who feed on the innocent because that's some bullshit. So she's fun to write. Red Sonja is the same thing in a certain way where she's a mercenary. I think I love writing about her being smart.
Mm,
That's what I do in Red Sonja Noir. I thought it would be really funny to write Red Sonja as a detective because that muscle is never in Red Sonja stories that much.
mm,
But she is in the Red Sonja stories that are about conflict and war. She's always very clever. She's
mm,
very smart about war. I said, I bet she's good enough to be a private eye. And the first Red Sonja Noir, which came out last year, was literally just the Maltese Falcon with Red Sonja in it. And I have another Red Sonja Noir coming out this year that's another Dashiell Hammett story adapted quietly to be a Red Sonja story. And lastly, we have Mr. Quartermain, who is tricky to write about. It is tricky as a white guy to write Africa in 1898, 1895.
mm,
And I have found ways around that by setting him against other colonial powers. He's an Englishman living in Africa. Uh, the books are kind of interesting in that they're from such a racially charged time and such a racist time and written by an Englishman about who spent a lot of time in Africa. And like Quartermain, H. Rider Haggard was the son of a missionary in Africa, and he absolutely went, "We're the problem.
mm,
The problem in Africa is that we're here." That's actually so that's a good start.
mm.
Um, but I found a thing about South African history and how the Germans in South Africa at the beginning of World War One decided, hey, let's participate in this thing that's happening all over the world, and attacked. They lived in German West South Africa, and they attacked British South Africa. And I did a story about a German patrol that makes the terrible mistake of taking over Alan Quartermain's ranch house when they're invading South Africa, and he kills them all except for one survivor, who's the guy who tells the story.
Mm.
So that's a very fun story. It's incredible art by Sebastian Perez, who I'd never worked with before.
Sebastian Perez did Johnny Quest most recently.
Yes,
Dynamite. So,
yes, he has an Alex Toth like facility with darkness. So the
mhm,
fact that this is a story that takes it's a story that takes place at night. So I was very excited. Sebastian was my choice for this, and I said please because he's so good with heavy black ink
right.
in scenes. And it's funny. I shouldn't probably shouldn't say this out loud, but he asked me, so who's Alan Quartermain? I said, well, he's Sean Connery in the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen movie, but don't just draw Sean Connery, and he just drew Sean Connery, and it looks great. It looks fucking great. He draws a great Sean Connery. I don't think the Connery estate will notice that we've done that, but it's a very fun book.
Nice. Nice. Well, like I said, guys, the final order cutoff for Giant Size Savage Tales #1 is March 30th. It'll be in stores April 29th, barring any
Good to
delays.
know.
So definitely check it out. There are several covers. The cover A is by Bjorn Berens. It's got that really fun, like video gamey feel.
Yeah,
And then there are several like cosplay covers, and it looks like there will be a blind bag variant as well. So if you're into the mystery of it
sure.
all, then pre-order that one. But either way, got to go to your local comic shop and ask them for it. Cover price on it is $5.99. So
Yes.
so check
And
it out.
it's 54 pages. It is worth it. It is double, two and a half times the size of the average comic book, so it's worth it.
Listen, Marvel comics are $5.99 for 28 pages. So
Right,
hey,
right.
that's
And
a,
I don't think it's 28 pages of story. I think there's some filler in there.
right.
But yeah, no, I think the Red Sonja story is very quick and to the point. It's 10 pages. I think Vampirella's 12, Quartermain's 14, and then because I'm wrapping up a whole story, Gulliver of Mars is 16. And you don't need to have read the previous issues. The Gulliver one is the only one that's part of an ongoing story, but you will pick up where we are very, very quickly.
Okay, nice. Well, with that, uh, David, this has been really cool. Like had not was not familiar with your work prior to this interview getting set up, and I'm really just been excited to get to know you for a little bit.
Thanks, man.
No, no problem. And I'm excited to check out this issue. Um, so, really quickly, what other things should people be on the lookout for from you? 'Cause I know you got a lot.
Well, in the next couple of months, I've been doing this project with Kevin Eastman of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle fame for a couple of years called Drawing Blood, which is about the life and adventures of a comic book creator with a career kind of like Kevin Eastman's. And we're up to issue 10. It comes from Image Comics. I will confess it is on a very unpredictable release schedule because Kevin is the busiest man in comics and Ben Bishop is very busy drawing it. He's still doing they're both still working on Last Ronin projects for the Turtles. Um but I'm extremely proud of that series. It's very personal stuff. Kevin, and what inevitably happens, of course, is you end up writing your own autobiography into things. But yeah, it's a contemporary comedy drama. It's not like anything else in comics. Drawing Blood from Image. And coming later this year, the project that I am most excited about, very quickly, is called Two-Fisted Fairy Tales. And I told you a little bit about my dad. He was also a World War II veteran.
Hmm.
And this is a true story. When I was a little boy, he chose to tell me all of the classic fairy tales as World War II combat stories about himself.
Hmm.
So the first time I heard Little Red Riding Hood, which is essentially the first issue of Two-Fisted Fairy Tales, Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother were in the French Resistance. The wolf was a Nazi major trying to get information out of them. And you know how the story ends with the woodsman coming in and saving them from the wolf. When my father told me the story, he kicked down the door with his combat boot and shot the wolf with a Thompson submachine gun. And that comic will be called Two Fisted. You know how in Hollywood, when you pitch something, you always say it's like this and it's like this.
Mhm.
Maybe because I'm a contrary person, I always like to do that in a way that makes the person hearing it go, "What the? How does that work?" So I've been pitching this thing for years as it's The Princess Bride meets Band of Brothers. It's a World War II platoon story being told as a bedtime story to a little boy in 1971. So and how we get into it real quickly is I see I am one of the main characters in the book as a 5-year-old, see a monster in the corner of my room, cry out for my parents, mom and dad come in, turn the lights on. Of course, there's no monster. Mom goes back to bed. And I ask my father, I'm asking a World War II combat veteran, Daddy, have you ever seen a monster? And
Mhm.
he says, actually, 1944 and 1945, I was running around Northern Europe in a tank chasing monsters. That's what I did. And he says, you want to hear about it? And he tells Little Red Riding Hood. Second issue is The Three Little Pigs. Third issue is Little Sleeping Beauty, a Little Goldilocks. The fourth issue is called Codename Rumpelstiltskin. And we go on in that vein. It'll be a 5-issue miniseries. It'll be coming later this year. The artist just started working on it. And if it's successful, I have planned out 3 5-issue miniseries. But let's get the first. And I will be making a lot of noise about that book when that's coming up on final order cutoff because I really want it to be successful. I really want people to read it.
It sounds amazing. So,
Thank you.
and you're certainly welcome to come back here and beat the drum for it.
I will reach out, man.
Awesome. And who's publishing that, by the way?
That'll be Dynamite.
Oh, nice.
And Dynamite never does creator-owned books, so I'm very touched that they are willing to. Honestly, I think we've had a great relationship, and they know I really, really, really wanted to do this book. And I think ultimately Nikki, the publisher, made the decision that he'd rather he be the one. If someone's going to lose money on it, he'd rather it be him than someone at a different company. So I very much appreciate them greenlighting it.
That is awesome. And Nick is
Thanks,
great,
man.
a great person for a variety of reasons, that being one of them as well. So
Yeah.
I'm
Well, and
excited.
you know, Nikki's another Italian boy from New Jersey, so we understand each other very, 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 very well.
Right.
You know,
Awesome. Well, Mr. David Avallone, this has been a pleasure. Again, you are welcome back anytime. Giant Size Savage Tales is on final order cutoff March 30th, so go ahead and pre-order that issue. And if they'd like to follow you on social media or anywhere online, where can they do
the I always make this joke that a name that got you teased in grade school is really great in the age of Google because they're I'm the first 11 pages of Google if you put in David Avallone. About page 11 or 12, you meet Lieutenant David Avallone, an Army veteran and lawyer who seems like a very nice guy. That is not me. I'm not a veteran and I'm not a lawyer. But I'm easy to find otherwise. I have a website, David Avallone Freelance. I have a Patreon, which is really where I'm putting my efforts now. I launched it in June. And there's a free subscription level. If you're interested in making comic books, if you have an interest in that, I am writing a book on writing comic books called How I Write Comics. And it's called How I Write Comics because when it comes to arts instruction, I kind of hate it when people present their way as the way. So
Mhm.
I'm not saying this is how you write comics. I am not saying this is how comics are written. I'm saying this is how I do it. These are my best practices. If they are helpful to you, fantastic. And the prologue of that is on the free side of the site. The chapters that I'm rolling out now are on the paid side, but the lowest paid side is $1 a month. So you can get this book for $12, among with a lot of other things. So that's where I'm on Blue Sky. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Facebook. I am on Twitter, but that account is locked, and I haven't really looked at it since the place became a Nazi bar.
Makes sense. Makes
Yeah.
sense. Well, I will leave all the relevant links in the description
Oh,
down
thank you.
below. Oh, no problem. And yeah, with that, go pre-order this book, and we will see you in another episode soon. Until then, stay safe, stay awesome, and read something dope today. Peace.